going to tell you how to become a U.S. citizen, so stick around. Hi everybody, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Michael Ashuri and I'm a U.S. immigration lawyer based in Los Angeles, California. At my law firm, we regularly post a lot of videos to keep our audience informed with updates in U.S. immigration law. So if you haven't yet subscribed to our channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button now. Also, if you have any questions during this video, feel free to put them in the comments below. Now, without further ado, let's talk about the reason why you're here, and it's to talk about how to become a citizen. This is a question that I get asked all the time, and it's because being a citizen has a lot of benefits. Generally, as a U.S. citizen, your status in the United States is more secure than if you were just a green card holder, if you were just a lawful permanent resident. Also, as a U.S. citizen, you don't have to constantly renew your status, which can be very expensive. You have the ability to vote when you're a U.S. citizen, and prolonged travel outside of the United States will not jeopardize your status once you're a U.S. citizen. So there's tons of benefits with having citizenship. So I want to explain how to become a citizen. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the process that's called naturalization. Naturalization is the process through which a permanent resident, a green card holder, can become a citizen. There's 9 major requirements to naturalize to become a citizen. Right now, we're going to go through those 9 requirements. The first requirement is that you must be at least 18 years old. If you're under 18 years old, you're not eligible to apply for naturalization. The second requirement is that you must have your green card. You must be a lawful permanent resident. And also, you must be a lawful permanent resident for at least 5 years. The standard amount of time that you have to have your green card before you can apply for naturalization is 5 years. However, in certain cases, if you are married to a U.S. citizen and various other conditions are met, then you can wait 3 years instead of 5 years. Again, in certain cases, if you're married to a U.S. citizen and you've been residing with your U.S. citizen spouse, you can apply for naturalization after 3 years instead of 5 years. So again, that's an exception, and it's going to come up throughout this video with a number of the requirements. So again, there's certain benefits involved with being married to a U.S. citizen and residing with a U.S. citizen. It has many benefits for naturalization, and we'll talk about those as we go through the different requirements. So again, requirement number 2 is that you must have your green card for 5 years for a standard application and 3 years if you're married to a U.S. citizen. Requirement number 3 is called the physical presence requirement. What this means is that you must be physically inside of the United States for at least 2.5 years over the last 5-year period. So, for standard applicants, USCIS will look back 5 years from the day that you submitted your naturalization application. Over that 5-year period that they look back, you need to have been physically inside of the United States for at least 2.5 years. So they'll count up the number of days, and there has to be 2.5 years been inside of the United States. That's called the physical presence requirement. An important note, just like the requirement before this, if you're married to a U.S. citizen, instead of 5 years, instead of 2.5 years over the last 5 years, they look back over the last 3 years and they check to see if you've been inside of the United States for at least 1.5 years over the last 3-year period. Again, that's the physical presence requirement. Now, move on to requirement number 4, which is the continuous residence requirement. For continuous residence, it's a little bit different than physical presence. Continuous residence, USCIS is checking to see whether you've been continuously inside of the United States over the last 5 years. So what can be a problem for continuous residence? It's prolonged travel outside of the United States. So if you leave the United States for many, many months, it can disrupt your continuous residence. Specifically, travel for 6 months or longer can be a problem, and so you want to make sure that you don't have any prolonged travel if you're planning on applying for naturalization. So yeah, that's the continuous residence requirement. Another important point that I want to mention about continuous residence is, again, if you're married to a U.S. citizen, USCIS does a continuous residence. They look back 3 years to see if over the last 3-year period you've had any really long trips outside of the United States. That's the continuous residence requirement. Now let's move on to requirement number 5. Requirement number 5 has to do with your residence in a particular state. To apply for naturalization, you must be residing in the same state for at least 3 months prior to filing your naturalization application. Very straightforward. Just make sure that you've been residing in the same state for at least 3 months prior to filing your naturalization application. That is requirement number 5. Now let's move on to requirement number 6, which is good moral character. For good moral character, it's kind of similar to how it sounds. USCIS is just making sure that you don't have any major red flags. For example, certain crimes. They're looking to see that you don't have certain crimes on your record and various other things to make sure that you're a person of good moral character. Again, USCIS for a standard application will look over the last 5 years to determine your good moral character. And if you're married to a U.S. citizen, they'll look back 3 years instead of 5 years. That's the good moral character requirement. Now, requirement number 7 regards proficiency. Basically, USCIS wants to make sure that you have a basic understanding of English. So they test this, and I'll explain to you how they test this later on. But it's important to know that you have to have a basic ability to understand English. And that's requirement number 7. An important point about the English proficiency is that there's many exceptions to English proficiency. So, if you're concerned about this, there are a number of exceptions, so you can look into that. And now let's move on to the next requirement, which is requirement number 8. And it's that you must have a basic understanding of U.S. government and U.S. history. And USCIS tests this literally by issuing you a test. The test is not something to really worry about, and I'll explain more about this later on in this video, but it's just important to know that it's a requirement. Again, that was requirement number 8, is that you have a basic understanding of U.S. history and U.S. government. Now, lastly, requirement number 9, again, I know we're finally here to requirement number 9, and it's that you must take an oath of allegiance, and the oath of allegiance basically states that you're going to support and defend the U.S. Constitution. Okay, so those are the 9 requirements to apply for naturalization. I know it might sound super confusing, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty straightforward. If you have any questions about that, go ahead and put them in the comments below. Now that we know the requirements to apply for naturalization, I want to actually tell you how it works. How does the process work when you want to apply for naturalization? There's 4 steps. Step number 1 is that you literally fill out an application. The application is the form N400, and it gets submitted to USCIS. Once you submit the application to USCIS, then you're going to go in for a fingerprinting appointment. The fingerprinting appointment is called the biometrics appointment. It's very straightforward. You go into a USCIS office, you get your digital fingerprint taken, and that's it. Then you leave. Then several months later, you're going to have an interview with a USCIS officer. This is called the naturalization interview. At the interview, they're going to do a lot of different things. First, at the interview, they're going to review your naturalization application with you. That form N400 that we talked about, at the naturalization interview, they review that application and they ask you various questions about that application. They check if there's any updates they need to be made. They ask you various questions based on the information you put in the N400, etc. After they ask you those questions, that's when they administer the English proficiency test. Basically, for the English proficiency, they ask you to read and write a sentence in English. Again, there's a lot of exceptions to this, so you want to make sure if you're concerned about this, check to see if you fall into one of those exceptions. Now, lastly, so again, at the naturalization interview, they review your N400, they also do the English proficiency test, and then they also do the civics test. At the civics test, we talked about this a little earlier, you have to have a basic understanding of U.S. History and government. So at the naturalization interview, that's where they test this. And the way that they test this is that they ask you 10 questions. The questions, if you're worried about the questions, there's a lot of materials online where you can use them to learn the types of questions that they'll ask you. Anyways, they ask you 10 questions, and you're required to get 6 of those questions right. If you get 6 of those questions right, you pass the test. Now, another important thing, if you get the first 6 right, they won't even ask you the other 4. You're good. So again, it's not a very difficult test. There's a lot of ways to prepare for it, to have a solid understanding of the questions that are going to be asked of you. So yeah, that's important to know. Now, the last part of the naturalization process, after the naturalization interview, is that, again, this is going to take place after the naturalization interview. You're going to do your oath of allegiance. I talked about this when we were talking about the naturalization requirements, where you have to take an oath to uphold, to support and defend the U.S. Constitution. You do this at the oath of allegiance ceremony. You go up, you give oath, and that's that. After you give your oath, maybe a couple weeks later, whatever the case may be, you will receive your certificate of naturalization. Congratulations, you've now become a U.S. citizen. I hope you guys don't think it was too difficult. It's actually, it can be really straightforward once you get the hang of it, once you know what to expect. It can be, it's not as difficult of a process as you might think. But yeah, so in this video, we talked about the 9 requirements to naturalize, and we also talked about the naturalization process, actually physically, how do you go about applying for naturalization? I hope you guys found this video extremely helpful. If you did, go ahead and hit the like button.